Hey fellas, me Trapper here. Today I'm going to talk about poaching. Now I get a lot of questions, a lot of emails, a lot of private messages, a lot of comments asking my thoughts on poaching. Am I for it? Am I against it? What do I think about game laws, etc., etc. Well, I can't tell you what to think or what to do or how to act. I can only explain what I do and why, and hopefully that may help some people in their decision-making process, because I think going forward a lot of people are going to have to make a lot of hard decisions. Now the first distinction that I make when it comes to game laws is a particular action a technical violation of a regulation, or is it a moral and ethical crime? I think there's a tremendous difference between those two. Here in Alabama, when it comes to beaver, there is no limit, no closed season, and no license required. A man can go out and kill 1,000 beavers in one day with dynamite. Absolutely legal, not a problem. But if I use a snare, I have to use a 3/32 inch diameter snare cable, because that's what the regulation book says. Now to me, that's ridiculous. In fact, it's contradictory. If you're not going to have a limit, if you're not going to have a season, if you're not going to have a license, and you can go out and shoot them with 30-06s, it's absurd to not be allowed to use 5/64 inch diameter cable, which in my opinion is a more effective cable. Fortunately, I live in a state where common sense prevails, and not only do I not care what size cable somebody uses for beaver, the game wardens don't really care either. They're just glad that somebody's out trapping beavers and reducing the overpopulation and controlling the damage that they can cause. Now, a lot of people don't live in a state like Alabama. They live in a state where the wardens are out trying to eliminate trapping, and they're trying to bust as many people as they can on the smallest technicality. And if you're in that situation, you have my deepest sympathy. So that's an example of what I consider a technicality, a rule book violation. And so when I go out and use a 5/64 inch cable on beaver, my conscience is clear. I don't have a problem looking myself in the mirror with doing that, because I know I'm doing an ethical and a moral right thing, regardless of what the rule book says, when the rule book was written by people that have no idea what the hell they're talking about. So let's look at the other extreme, moral and ethical crimes. We had a guy down in Mobile Bay who was caught crabbing illegally. He had several hundred female crabs in his possession, and they were bearing eggs. And when the game wardens pulled up, he started throwing them over the side. To me, that's not only criminal, that's ethically and morally wrong. It's not just a violation of the game law or the rule book. He's stealing from his fellow man. He's stealing from future generations. And he's destroying populations with wanton disregard. That's a criminal SOB as far as I'm concerned. And there's a tremendous difference between that and somebody that is violating a technicality in the rule book. Another example, recently they caught two guys up in Tennessee that had been going out night hunting deer. They had shot over 50-something deer, and they had videoed themselves doing it. Now, some of the deer they had wounded, and they would walk up to them with a centerfire rifle and blow their heads off and video it and laugh and joke about it. Once again, no problem. That's an ethical and a moral wrong. Not only is it a crime, it's simply wrong. They're stealing from their neighbors. They're stealing from future generations. They're doing it with a wanton recklessness and a wanton disregard for the animal itself. So that's two extremes. One is a rule book violation, and one is a moral and ethical wrong. Now there's a lot of gray area in between those two, and that's where all of the discussion and the arguments usually come in. For instance, fishing. Nothing seems to get fishermen pissed off more than when I post a video on using hoop nets or catfish traps or box traps or something like that. That really seems to get their blood boiling, and I usually get viciously attacked. If everybody used box traps, we wouldn't have any fish left. If everybody used nets, it'd wipe out all the catfish. There'd be nothing left to catch. Blah, blah, blah. If you were a real man, you'd use a hook and a line or a rod and a reel. But the only reason you don't do that is because you're too stupid to know how to catch a fish. Whatever. So consider this. You got a favorite camping spot on the river, like where I am. You want to throw a fish box in so that when you come out in a couple of days to camp, you can pull it up and maybe you got a few fish in there and you don't have to go fishing. You can pull them up and have something to eat. Now, in the eyes of the law, it doesn't matter if you only catch 2 fish and the limit is 50. Even though you've only taken 2 fish, you violated the law because you used a trap instead of a hook and a line. I have a real problem with considering that to be wrong. In fact, I don't consider it wrong. Now, here in my state, it's perfectly legal to use traps as long as I pay the state I think it's $125 for the commercial fishing license to use the trap. So a method that's blatantly illegal suddenly becomes perfectly acceptable and legal as long as I've paid the right people enough money. Sort of like a pistol permit, you know. You got to pay to exercise your God-given Second Amendment rights. So there's a lot of gray area in there, and really that's where you have to make your own decisions based on your area, your knowledge, and your situation. Now there's another form of poaching that people rarely discuss, especially outdoorsmen. And this type of poaching doesn't involve guns or nets or anything of the sort. It involves bulldozers. Now the woods that I'm talking to you from have been here as long as I have. They're beautiful, they're unspoiled, and they're along the banks of a local river. But in another year, this is all going to be paved. It's going to be asphalt. You see, they're turning this into more subdivisions, more strip malls, more gas stations, because we don't have enough subdivisions, strip malls, or gas stations. We don't need unspoiled woodlands like this that provide a natural habitat for the game. No, we need asphalt and concrete. So when they come in here and they flatten all of this and pave it, all of the wildlife that exists here, the beaver, the fox, coyotes, the deer, everything is going to get pushed out of here. They're not actually going to kill the animals with the bulldozers themselves. They don't do that. They just push them into an ever smaller area. And what happens, of course, is that some of the animals are going to get run over. They're all out in the street, out in the interstate. You see them every day getting hit. They're going to overbrowse the existing habitat that they're pushed into. They're going to overpopulate. You end up with issues with the health of the animal population. And ultimately, they get pushed into the subdivisions themselves. And you can see from this clip, this is no habitat for a fox. A fox is not supposed to be living here. But there's a reason that this fox is here, and it's because he has nowhere else to go. Now the guys that do this, they're not labeled as poachers. They're not labeled as criminals. They get rich, they go to the lake, they go to their rich man's hunting club, and then they lecture a man who's out trying to feed his family. They lecture him about rules and regulations and game laws when they've laid waste to beautiful unspoiled areas. So I guess my point really with this is, before the high and mighty types out there start wagging their fingers at somebody for using the wrong size snare cable, or a man trying to feed his family by taking an extra deer over the limit, you need to get your priorities straight before you start judging people like that. You need to take a step back and put things in perspective. And when you've got areas like this that get totally and completely destroyed and the game completely pushed out, it's hypocritical to turn around and wag your finger about a fella using the wrong size trap or something of that nature. That's absurd. You know, I actually had a guy watch one of my videos on the inner city trapping that I did, and the guy's from up north, out of state. He actually went to the trouble to look up the regulations, the trapping regulations in the state of Alabama, and then lecture me because I didn't get written permission, which is required, to trap an abandoned vacant lot in a downtown area. And that lot was owned by a bank. It was being repossessed by a bank, and there was no way to get written permission to trap there. And I went in and I took a few beaver out of the creek there to feed my family, and this son of a bitch is going to lecture me about the law. Well, let me tell you something. If you're one of these finger wavers and one of these high and mighty types, let me give you some advice. Before you start lecturing a guy who is feeding his family by the sweat of his own brow, perhaps you ought to get on the phone and you ought to call the president and lecture him about the law. Perhaps you ought to lecture him about enforcing our borders and enforcing immigration law. And when you're done lecturing the president, maybe you ought to get on the phone and call Congress. And maybe you ought to lecture them about obeying the Constitution. Maybe you ought to talk to them about not spending $20 trillion that we don't have and then sticking our grandchildren with the bill. Maybe you can get on the phone and you can call the Federal Reserve and you can explain to them that the Constitution says that legal money is gold and silver, and they have no authority to be doing what they're doing. And then you can go all the way down the line through your local officials. You can lecture your local sheriff about the fact that the Constitution doesn't have anything in there about having to pay your sheriff for the privilege of carrying a pistol. And when you get finished lecturing all of these people, then you can come talk to me. Or you can come talk to a guy trying to feed his family. A guy that I would much rather see a man take an extra deer on occasion or trap something out of a river, even if he doesn't have written permission. I'd rather see him do that than get on welfare and sponge off of everybody else. So before you lecture me about the law, before you lecture me about legality and right and wrong, perhaps you ought to take a step back, think things through, and put things in perspective.